Welcome to this explainer from Dr. P's pod. Today, we're going to tackle a huge question. What makes us who we are? We're going to dig into some pretty compelling evidence that shows how our very first moments don't just shape our minds, they literally build our brains.
I mean, this is the classic question, right? Nature versus nurture. Is our destiny pretty much locked in by our genes, or is it sketched out by everything we experience? It's a question that philosophers have chewed on for centuries, but what does the biology actually have to say about it?
All right, let's get into it. To really get to the bottom of this, we're going to look at a landmark study from 1991, published in the Journal of Neuroscience. The researchers wanted to push past all the philosophy and find a real, physical link between our early environment and the people we eventually become. So here's what they did. They set up this really powerful, kind of stark experiment. They took infant Rhesus monkeys, who are, close relatives of ours on the primate tree, and created two completely separate worlds for them to grow up in. The whole point was to isolate one single crucial variable: social contact. And when I say the contrast was extreme, I mean it was night and day. On one side, you had the socially reared group. They grew up exactly how you'd expect, in a rich, social world with their moms and other young monkeys. But the other group, the socially deprived monkeys, they spent their first 9 months in total isolation. We're talking opaque steel chambers, no sight, no touch, no contact with another living being. So what happened? What were the long-term effects of these two totally different childhoods? Well, the consequences of that early isolation weren't subtle, not at all. They were profound, and as the researchers would discover, they were terrifyingly permanent. This quote from the study really just says it all. The effects were devastating, and they didn't just fade away over time. That experience, in just the first 9 months of life, sent ripples through their entire existence. So when they say devastating, what does that actually look like? Well, this table gives us a pretty grim picture. The researchers started seeing a whole cluster of behaviors they called the isolate syndrome. Things like constant repetitive movements, circling, swaying back and forth. Socially, these monkeys were just broken. They were fearful, they were aggressive, they would injure themselves, and later in life, they couldn't mate properly. And those that did have offspring were often abusive. These were clear signs of really, really deep psychological damage. But here's the part that's just staggering. This wasn't a temporary thing. They checked in on these monkeys when they were almost 20 years old, well into their adult lives. And those same behaviors were still there. Even trying to re-socialize them later on didn't work. The damage was done. It seemed to be irreversible. But the big question remained. Why? To solve that mystery, the scientists had to go deeper. They had to look past the behaviors and get right inside the brain itself. They were searching for a physical explanation, a biological scar left behind by that early solitude. Now, to understand what they found, we need to get our heads around one key term: chemoarchitecture. I know, it sounds super technical, right? But don't worry. Just think of it like the brain's chemical wiring diagram. It's the map of how and where all the important chemical messengers, like dopamine and serotonin, are organized. And that map is absolutely essential for everything the brain does. And this is the absolute bombshell finding of the entire study. The brains of the socially deprived monkeys weren't just sadder or different in some vague way. They were physically, structurally altered. Their experience hadn't just left a bad memory, it had physically rewired their brains. Just look at this number. In the brains of those isolated monkeys, there was a 58% reduction in neurons using a chemical called substance P. Now, substance P is a key player in how the brain processes things like stress and social information. A drop of more than half is a massive physical change that goes a long way to explaining their fearful, withdrawn behavior. And that wasn't all. They also found another huge drop, a 43% reduction in dopamine-producing neurons. This wasn't a part of the brain that's critical for movement and for our sense of reward and motivation. This helps explain both those repetitive, stereotyped movements and the profound lack of engagement they had with the world. But what's really fascinating here is that the damage wasn't just random, it was targeted. A brain area called the striatum, which is a hub for movement and reward, was hit hard. But another area, the amygdala, which is the brain's main fear center, it looked totally normal. This suggests that some parts of the brain absolutely require social input to develop correctly, while others, it seems, can mature okay without. Okay, so let's zoom out. What does all of this difficult but really important research tell us about ourselves? It points to this incredibly profound and fundamental link between the world we are born into and the physical brains that we build. The takeaway here is just so clear and so powerful. Social connection, touch, interaction, these aren't just fluffy, nice-to-have things. They are biological ingredients. It's like, just as our bones need calcium to grow strong, a developing brain requires social experience to wire itself correctly. The study's own conclusion really says it all. Our social environment directly influences the physical maturation of the brain's chemical systems after we're born. So in other words, it's not really a question of whether we're born or we're made. It's more like we are born to be made by the world and the people around us. And that leaves us with a huge question to think about. If social connection really is a biological necessity, as fundamental to our development as air or water, how does that change the way we think about community, about family, and about our responsibilities to each other? Thanks so much for joining this explainer from Dr. P's Pod.